Joining us now is CJ Werleman. He's a op-ed columnist for Salon.com and Middle East Eye. CJ, thanks again for joining us.
No worries, guys. Good to be chatting with you.
Great. So basically, we've been talking a lot this past week about the sort of new eruption, the Sam Harris, Bill Maher, Ben Affleck, Reza Aslan, true nature of Islam, terrorism, atheism, all of these issues that sort of bubbled up. I should say, by full disclosure, that I have worked for Reza Aslan. He's really a personal friend at this point, and someone that I've collaborated with. So I guess that's my disclosure up front. What I've found really disturbing, and I don't have, I should be, and again, also really upfront, that I don't really identify as an atheist or not an atheist. I don't have a lot of kind of personal investment or identification around that issue. But what I have found really disturbing is the way that this sort of argument put forward by Harris about Islam has sort of skipped over almost any sort of any material or contextual understanding for what actually drives terrorism, which is pretty ironic given that the whole worldview he's trying to frame is supposed to be very empirical, very rational, and he seems to be only caught up in some very, very kind of basic, trivial ideological questions, not historical, social, or contextual ones. I'm curious what your take is. You're a avid and very publicly spoken atheist, but you have a different take on what's driving groups like ISIS, and you see danger in how Sam Harris is framing the issue. So why don't you explain where you're coming from and how you are framing and contextualizing this?
Yeah, well, I'm an atheist.
Yeah,
I'm a proud card-carrying atheist.
You guys get cards?
Atheist. Yeah,
cool.
You do. You pay $100 a year and you get one.
All right.
And yeah, but but as an atheist, I so want to believe that religion poisons everything. I so want to believe that religion is the root of all evil, but
Right.
it isn't. It simply isn't.
Right.
It'll always has been and always will be, money and greed that lies at the heart of human darkness. And it's our greed, it's these resource-based wars, it's our meddling in the Middle East, it's the destabilization of or overthrowing of moderate governments and replacing a vacuum where Islamicism has been able to thrive. So it's such a one-dimensional view that Harris has of the Middle East. And the glorious irony is when, I'll quote Noam Chomsky here. Chomsky said that, Harris almost completely knows nothing about the Middle East and Islam,
Right.
but takes these passages of the Quran out of context. But when you quote Sam Harris back, then his defenders will say, oh, look, you're taking Sam Harris out of context.
Right.
So, I find that irony delicious.
Yeah, and again, what I find confusing to me, it's very obvious as somebody with any sort of bare minimum knowledge of the region, whether it's academic or having lived and spent time there, that this guy's knowledge of this place is at the very least drastically, kind of profoundly limited. But at the same time, what I'm trying to reconcile, and I'm wondering if you could speak more directly to, is that if on one hand Sam Harris is out saying we as a society, we as a global culture need to get a lot more empirical about things, and we need to look rigorously at the causes and conditions of social and material phenomenon, not think magically, not think in terms of our beliefs or our ideas or our whims, but really be rigorous in our analytic approach. And then his approach to Islam and the Middle East doesn't take into account any of the variables that actually drive conditions there, and then seem to have this sort of this single-pointed focus on a religion that he does not like, a people he's clearly kind of uncomfortable with. And then from that, there's some really disastrous policy implications from that. Do you see what I'm saying? Like that there's some type of contradiction in what he's advocating as the approach we should have to problems versus what he's actually doing when he talks about those issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And his approach to, look, I'm troubled by Islam. I'll put that up front too. Like any ideology that pretends to know the answers to all of life's questions, Islam sucks. There's no two ways about it. my approach is, but that's not the reason why they hate us. And my problem with Harris is it's almost speaking in the language of hyper-nationalism, and bad things always invariably follow when you speak in that language. I mean, ISIS speaks in the language of victimhood. And then when we adopt this new atheist language of saying Islam is the problem, Islam is the root of all evil, Islam is the motherlode of bad ideas, all we're doing is, the subtext to that is we're extolling our own virtues, and then we're actually looking at the scientific evidence of why these countries have fallen apart, and why the reasons why they inevitably end up hating us, and why they want to commit atrocities against us. It has nothing to do with a scripture taken out of the Quran. It has everything to do with the reason that our policies in the Middle East have created a massive economic underclass, and it's also a lack of this intellectual dishonesty where we need to be real with ourselves. We need to look at our actions and go, right, our arms for oil program is needed because we're addicted to cheap oil. Every U.S. president has learned the lesson of Carter that if you allow oil to skyrocket to $10 a gallon, you're going to lose the office of the president. Allow oil dissipate. Let's be honest, it's our policy which creates this economic underclass in these regions. And whilst that economic underclass continues to thrive, there's always going to be this vacuum filled by hyper-religious, far-right-wing ideologies. Far-right-wing religious ideologies come from a lack of economic order and social chaos and a lack of unemployment, and it's our policies which inflict that on these regions.
Right, and also, again, I think it's another sort of important thing to get very specific about is even these brands of fundamentalism we're talking about. First of all, it's not just politically correct or a nice thing to say, which I've made this point many times. It's not just, okay, these aren't all Muslims and they don't represent all Muslim belief systems because we're nice, politically correct people. It's because they literally don't, right? That is just an inaccurate understanding of the religion of over a billion people, like it or not. But the reality is that there is a very specific brand of fanaticism, which is Wahhabism, which has very specific roots in this political arrangement of Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis do pretty aggressively fund sort of educational outreach as well as groups with really fanatical leanings. Another area that directly illustrates the types of relationships and dysfunctional codependencies that you're talking about. I mean, get to that more specifically, how this is not an Islam problem, this is a U.S. foreign policy problem, and then there is a specific, it would be like saying that all Buddhists are represented by a handful of fanatical ultra-nationalist monks in Burma right now who are killing Muslims. It's just empirically inaccurate. And you're also actually ignoring a profoundly serious problem in Burma that really is a danger.
Well, have a look at exactly. You've hit the nail on the head. If you look at Turkey and Malaysia and Indonesia, these are democracies. These are majority Muslim countries with healthy, thriving democracies. Now, it's no coincidence then that the most destabilized and chaos-riddled countries that have a majority Muslim population are the countries which have the most amount of oil. Mm-hmm. I mean, and so Saudi Arabia and Yemen and Iraq and Iran, these what percentage of the world's oil reserves are in these countries, and these are the countries we have completely surrounded with our military bases, and by allowing these regimes to survive, and I made the point on the Young Turks the other day that the Saudi Arabian monarchy only exists because of our support. Right. And that regime, then, we arm that regime with the tune of $55 billion, which is the total number of arms sales that go to the region, right, to prop up these regimes so they can defend themselves from their neighbors that eye off their oil, but also keep the people repressed within their own borders. And we have created, these economies have become economic basket cases. So when there's no jobs, when there's no hope for the future, they turn to Islamicism. And that is a response to ultimately to our foreign policy, not what is specifically contained within the Quran. There is a reason no one wakes up in the morning and says, I want to chop somebody's head off. That's not how human beings, are raised generally. but atrocities are committed down the line in response to generations of revenge. Each generation is being raised to exact revenge on the injustices visited on the previous generation.
Yeah, and again, I think this is the other really important point to raise here in terms of basic history that is, missing from the Sam Harris discourse and the Bill Maher discourse is, the other reason that certain brands of Islamic politics, and again, I would still make finding all of them distasteful. There's a radical difference between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I mean, Iran, as an example, had, certainly many human rights violations, fundamentalism, but the whole premise of that system is a very, like it or not, it's a very innovative one. I mean, there isn't like traditional roots of some type of quasi-Islamic democracy with clerics playing the role of almost like a Supreme Court. I mean, that's a distinct thing. But I think the other reason that we're talking about the appeal of these movements in the Middle East is because there's also we're also living in a time where the secular movements of modern Middle Eastern politics and secular governments were terrible failures. So even when we look at polling data that says something like, well, this many of Muslims in X country want some brand of Sharia, or they want some brand of Islamic finance, that is not motivated primarily by, because these poll numbers might have been entirely different in the 60s or 70s. These poll numbers are motivated by, Saddam Hussein, Assad, Mubarak. I mean, these governments were horrible, horrible failures, and they're associating, or in the Palestinian territories, the popularity of Hamas was not just because their militancy towards Israel, and actually there was a lot of condemnation and of terrorist actions, although some support for them as well. But a big reason Hamas won in Gaza was because they delivered social services and they were perceived of as less corrupt. And when that brand is associated with Islamic politics, one that delivers social services and is less corrupt, that's going to have more popular appeal. And again, that is rooted in the same objective material conditions you're talking about, and not in, there's, hundreds of millions of people who are just sort of like mouth-breathing zombies who've read some holy book and want to blow everything up.
Correct. And that's exactly why there's the social upheaval in Turkey at the moment is only moderate. I mean, you have, street protests like you do here in the United States, but Turkey is doing a pretty good job in meeting the economic needs of its people. But where you have a collapse of liberalism, where you have a collapse of liberal democracies, that's when, social chaos reigns. And that's when people, as was mentioned earlier, that's when people turn to these far right-wing ideologies that do deliver, whether that's social services or comfort or whatsoever. And we see that also within our own country, United States. The 9 poorest states in this nation are also the 9 most religious, where you have a collapse of social order, where you have a collapse of, economic liberalism. People do turn to extremes.
Yeah. So, and I want to turn this back to the kind of interrogation of the the self-reflection of people who are drawn to this Sam Harris, Bill Maher perspective, because I found it really astonishing. I mean, I've had responses from people that have taken me saying things that are similar to what we're discussing right now, or Matt or Sam, and the response is like, oh well, you guys are incapable of criticizing Islam or Islamic cultures, which is astonishing. I mean, I've been relentlessly critical of Saudi Arabia as an example, or you don't take misogyny seriously, or you don't take religious fundamentalism seriously, which again, even as a non-atheist, I take religious fundamentalism of every variety tremendously seriously. It's a big problem in today's world. But what I have never gotten the answer to in response is, what is the upshot of this Sam Harris perspective? Because some people will say, well, I just agree with Sam Harris in terms of, Islam is terrible and Muslims are kind of broadly brain dead and it's a big problem. But at the same time, I don't agree with invading Iraq, torture, racial profiling, or an indefinite occupation of Palestinian territories, all of which Harris does support. So again, going to like actual policy, there's some real problems here. What is the upshot of it? It seems like, is this just that we can sit back and kind of feel smug and enjoy our supposed sophistication and not deal with the hard problems of oil, trade, development? Like, what is the appeal of this in terms of, these people are so backward, they're terrible, blah, blah, blah. Like, what is that just an evasion of dealing with hard things, or is it just the pleasure in feeling superior to somebody?
Well, if you listen to Sam Harris and you want to understand why bad things happen in the world, then like any ideology that gives a simple answer, he gives a simple answer. That's not to say that Sam Harris is not a brilliant individual. Mm-hmm. His intellect he is a brilliant intellectual person. He's just terrifically wrong when it comes to understanding the roots of terrorism, understanding the political and geopolitical dynamics within the Middle East. But it's also self-serving propaganda. It makes us feel good about ourselves. When Sam Harris says that Islam is a mother load of bad ideas and we want to understand why bad things happen in the world, it makes us feel good as Americans or Westerners or Australians. Oh shit, the problem isn't with us, the problem is with them. We don't have to look internally. The problem is external. So there's the appeal.
Yeah, that's what it seems like. It seems like we can just sort of sit back and coast because we went through the Enlightenment or something. And again, now I'm not discounting those accomplishments, and I'm not a relativist, of course. But at the same time, we're creating a lot of problems, and we're not seeing the implications of those problems we create. One of the things I'd like you to speak to is the specific example of suicide bombings, which I know you've spoken and written about. Obviously, this is a tactic that is on its face, tremendously repulsive and problematic, and it's very understandable why people would, react strongly to that. There is the perception that this is a tool specifically of Islamic politics, Islamic terrorism. That's not empirically accurate. So again, I feel like I always have to make this distinction. This is not about justifying or excusing these actions, but it's about explaining the full context in which they operate in and the many, many different groups that have deployed these tactics. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, well, the most exhaustive and robust studies into suicide terrorism is both the University of Chicago study into terrorism, which was funded by the Pentagon, rather, right, and also Flinders University, which compiled a suicide terrorism database. Both these, independent studies brought together and looked into every single act of suicide terrorism since 1980 to 2010, and what they found was almost the opposite of the case that people like Dawkins and Harris and Hitchens were making in the aftermath of 9/11. When 9/11 happened, we knew so little about, jihadi terrorism and so forth. And so when the planes flew into the building, our knee-jerk reaction was, it must be Islam. It must be this radical Islam doctrine, Quran, which is inspiring people to do this. But the Suicide Terrorism Database and the University of Chicago looked into every single act, and I think it was something like 365 acts of suicide terrorism in those years, and 95% of those suicide atrocities or acts were motivated primarily by politics, right, revenge, altruism, humiliation, and so forth. And 95% of all terrorist attacks that have been committed in those 3 decades were targeted against an occupying force, whether that was the United States in Afghanistan, Iraq, or Russia in Chechnya, and so forth. And actually, 1/3 of those terrorist attacks, suicide attacks, were secular or Marxist, whether it's the Tamil Tigers or the PKK in Turkey.
Right. And actually, I'm reminded in Ghost Wars, which is this excellent book on the history of the Mujahideen and U.S. policy in Afghanistan, that there was this operation that the CIA and the ISI wanted these Mujahideen fighters to engage in the 80s, of blowing up a really important tunnel and supply chain that would disrupt the Soviets. And basically, it was an operation that in effect would be a suicide bombing. And at that time, none of the Mujahideen fighters would take them up on it because it was considered, it was like haram. Like, I can't commit suicide. So, even, that, even in this sort of that version of radical Islamic politics, the shifting historical basis of what is and is not acceptable is incredibly fluid. And it's not some ingrained thing in the system, which is your point again. What do you think is the most useful role then if you want to sort of advocate, again, I think if you're an atheist, it's very clear, in the United States or domestically, you're going to be advocating for, keeping science curriculums clean and straightforward, for medical research to kind of introduce more rationality into the public sphere. When it comes to these foreign policy questions, what is the specific role of the atheist community in addressing these issues, and an alternative to what has been advocated by the new atheists?
Well, I think the problem is even more than the education system. I mean, the Middle East, it's remarkable how little Americans know about the Middle East. And why it's remarkable is it's a region of the world that we're so dependent on. It's a region of the world that we allocate more government taxpayers' money to any other region on the planet.
Right.
We're invested so heavily in the selling of our arms there. We're dependent on their oil. We've been involved in 3 wars over the course of 3 decades. In that area, we have military bases. But the average American knows so little about this region. In fact, a National Geographic poll turned up that 68% of Americans, this is in 2007, so 4 years after your invasion, couldn't locate the country of Iraq on a map. 2/3 of Americans can't discern the difference between Shia and Sunni. In fact, on the U.S. Intelligence Committee and the Senate Intelligence Committee, it was discovered that 40% of those sitting there could not discern the difference between Sunni and Shia. And
right.
And something like 70%. I might be getting this number wrong, but something like 70% of Americans believe that Iranians and Afghanistan, Iran and Afghanistan are Arab countries. So it's not only is our education system failing, but on top of that, you have a media class which is totally a tool and an instrument for the state in this country. The drumbeats of war, nothing is questioned. There's so few journalists like Jeremy Scahill and Glenn Greenwald, for example, who speak truth to power, who question the motives and the objectives of why we're going into these countries. And they allow the political class to speak in the benign language of using terms like vital interests or regional interests or national interests. What they're saying there is arms and oil. They're the only 2 interests we have in these regions. So when you have an electorate which is totally clueless about the Middle East, and then you have a media class which doesn't question the motives of our government, then Americans are left utterly confused about what is going on in the Middle East and what we can do or not do in solving these problems.
Well, CJ Werleman, I really appreciate your time. CJ is an op-ed columnist for Salon.com and Middle East Eye. Thanks so much for joining us.
No worries, Michael. Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me on.